Thank you to the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network and to our sponsors. And I wanted to welcome again everyone here today. I wanted to give you a little background about how Lymphoma Canada became involved in creating a white paper with the same title, Improving Access to Innovative Cancer Therapies in Canada. And that is because in the lymphoma landscape, there are many new therapies that have come forward. And of course, part of our mission statement is to submit to all regulatory bodies for new therapies. We spend a lot of our time gathering information with our patients and elsewhere with other jurisdictions. And what we found was that a number of innovative therapies that did not have further data sets, and Elizabeth will go into more detail, were in fact being given a negative recommendation. And we looked at the broader landscape and spoke to our colleagues at other cancer sites and found this was not lymphoma alone, but many cancer sites were recognizing the same pattern. So we thought about how we could change, if possible, this status and what we could do to talk to the regulatory bodies and explain to them that the landscape has changed, innovative therapies have changed the way that one may look at submissions and data sets. And so we got together and decided that we were going to create a white paper. I want to thank as well Louise Binder and Martina Elias, who along with Elizabeth Lye created the paper, and all of our signatories that you could see on screen. This turned out to be quite a interesting endeavor because there was quite a lot of information, and we found it was quite nuanced at the same time, that this information wasn't necessarily known by many. So we were more intrigued, and the more we researched and the more we realized that there were other jurisdictions, in fact, and other options for looking at this data. It is new, it is novel, and rather than just giving it a negative recommendation, what perhaps could be done to move things forward. So with that, I will turn it over to Elizabeth Lye, who will give you the full presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Robin, and welcome, everyone. And thank you to CCSN for inviting us to participate in their webinar series. In order to put the drug access discussion in context, I'm going to start off with a brief introduction about the evolving and increasing, basket of knowledge regarding the biology of cancer and how this is reshaping the treatment landscape for cancer patients. I will briefly touch on drug approval and reimbursement processes in Canada, although I'm sure most of you are already well aware of these processes, and how many of the newer cancer therapies are being assessed in the context of these existing processes. I'll then take you through an analysis that we did of pCODR decisions published between 2012, when CAS started publishing their recommendations online, and the end of last year, 2017, and specifically with respect to drug indication combinations that were submitted with non-RCT data or limited data sets. And then we'll discuss, or I'll discuss, the potential impact of these negative negative pCODR recommendations on access to these innovative therapies, as well as provide a couple of concrete recommendations that can be implemented by pCODR, PCPA, and the payers in order to improve access to these therapies for cancer patients in Canada. And to end on a positive note, I will also briefly discuss some of the changes that we've actually already started seeing just in the first 2-3 months of 2018 in the pCODR process. So over the past, decade or more, new and improved technologies and tools in the lab have made it quite a bit easier for scientists to analyze the molecular combination of tumors, particularly the genomic changes, and as a result, our classification of different cancers has evolved tremendously. With the identification of changes in the tumor cells as well as in their environment, we're starting to see an influx of new therapies that specifically target these aberrations and the processes they control. And as companion diagnostics are increasingly being integrated into drug development and clinical trials, we're also able to more accurately identify which patients will benefit from these therapies or benefit most from these therapies, and allowing us to employ a much more precise approach to cancer treatment than in the past. So monoclonal antibodies and small molecule protein inhibitors have been around, for a while, and used in a number of different cancers. However, as our knowledge of tumor biology improves, we are seeing more and more of these therapies in the cancer treatment landscape. And in addition to that, with our better understanding of the immune processes that are involved in tumor recognition as well as killing, we're seeing the evolution of new cellular therapies and other immune therapies that are beginning to result in a number of additional treatment options for patients, many of whom have no other potentially effective treatment options available to them. And these include, cellular immunotherapies like CAR-T, as well as oncolytic virus therapies. And just as a great example of some of the changes that we've observed in the cancer landscape is with non-small cell lung cancer. Not only is this cancer one of the most common types, but it is also one of the most deadly. And traditional treatments such as chemotherapies for metastatic tumors have only been marginally effective, and survival rates have been poor. So as you can see on the right, and hopefully my cursor works there, non-small cell lung cancer historically in the past was divided into two primary subtypes based on the histology. So what the tumor looked like under the microscope, and also where it originated from within the lungs. However, more recently, with large-scale gene expression profiling of these tumors, in addition to other tools, classification has evolved to one that's based on the molecular characterization. And now there are a number of different, over a dozen different subtypes of these tumors characterized by various gene mutations leading to aberrant expression of the proteins that they transcribe. And so with that, we're seeing a number of new treatments where we have seen and continue to see a number of treatments for lung cancer that specifically target some of these molecular changes or the processes they control. And this has led to improved outcomes for many patients. So while these great advances in treatment are exciting and certainly hold promise, what cancer patients really want to know is whether or not they can access them. So this slide shows a very simplistic schematic of drug approval and public funding processes for new drug products in Canada. I actually stole it from pCODR's presentation from one of their previous webinars that you guys did. So there you go, there's your credit. And I won't spend too much time going through it, but briefly, Health Canada obviously authorizes the marketing and sale of drugs in Canada based on the assessment of both efficacy and safety. And then once the drug is authorized for sale, it goes through the health technology assessment process, the HTA process, to assess the value of the drug in the context of our healthcare system. And there are three primary bodies that assess the value of new drug indication combinations. All provinces and territories except Quebec use CADIS processes to review drugs, pCODR for oncology drugs, and CDR for all non-oncology drugs. And Quebec has its own process through NS to review drugs for the same purpose. Once a recommendation is made by the HTA body, it goes to price negotiations at PCPA. And if and when a pricing agreement is reached, the provinces and cancer agencies make the ultimate decision on whether a new drug will be funded in their jurisdiction. Some important things to remember. Not all drugs approved by Health Canada are publicly funded. Each province and territory has their own publicly funded prescription drug benefit program, or many programs in some provinces. The drug coverage provided by each of the provinces can vary, and it can vary a lot. Also, private insurance may be provided through employers and or purchased individually. However, I would like to note that it's important to note that the quantity and quality of private drug coverage can also vary greatly. This gets left out of a lot of discussions where we gloss over the fact that between 85 and 90% of Canadians are covered by some sort of private insurance. However, the quality of that insurance can be limited. So there is a process within Health Canada's regulatory assessment framework that allows for expedited access to promising new drug products that have limited clinical data. So priority review can be granted for promising new products that are intended for either the treatment, the prevention, or diagnosis of life-threatening or severely debilitating diseases, for which either there is no alternative therapy available in Canada, or where potentially the new product represents a significant improvement in the efficacy safety profile over existing products. And in this case, in such a case, a notice of compliance with conditions, NOCC, can be issued by Health Canada. And what this is an authorization to sell the drug, market the drug, in Canada, with the condition that the manufacturer undertakes additional studies to verify the clinical benefit or other conditions that are required by Health Canada. And manufacturers seeking priority review and an NOCC often submit data from non-comparative early phase trials, so phase 1 or 2 trials, while awaiting the results of randomized controlled trials, RCTs, or additional other clinical studies. So why am I talking about NOCC? Well, the reason I brought it up is that over the past few years, Health Canada has granted an NOCC for several new cancer therapies that with limited clinical data, but where the clinical benefit is promising. In some of these cases, there's no alternative therapy available in Canada. In other cases, the new drug, Health Canada has determined or decided that the new drug represents a significant improvement with respect to efficacy and or safety over existing treatments. On the other hand, what we have started noticing a couple of years ago is that pCODR was increasingly providing negative funding recommendations for these therapies that had received an NOCC and were submitted with limited data sets, obviously leading to delays and in many cases, denials of access through the public and even some of the private drug plans to these therapies. So as Robin mentioned, this obviously was concerning to us and many other patient groups. So we decided to take a closer look at the pCODR decisions and look at the trends over time and negative recommendations for these therapies that were submitted with non-comparative data or non-RCT data. And so we went through all the records available online on CADA's website between January 2012 and December 31st, 2017, and determined that pCODR issued recommendations. These would be final recommendations for 99 oncology drug funding requests. And submissions supported by limited data sets accounted for 20% of these submissions. So on the left, you can see the total number of submissions for each year through to the end of 2017. The blue bars indicate submissions with RCT data, the orange non-RCT data. And I'm not attributing, there's no statistical significance attached to any of these numbers or changes over time. They're just really there to illustrate the trends that we are seeing. And as you can see, the number of submissions submitted with non-comparative data looks to have increased beginning in 2015. And if you look on the right, while the submissions with RCT data is a little bit is pretty stable, a little bit all over the map, also maybe increased a little bit starting in 2015 as well. But what you see when you look at the percentage of submissions with non-RCT data, that also seems to have increased percentage of total submissions over time as well in the past 3 years. And 2017 is a little bit misleading because a number of recommendations came out very early in 2018 that were submitted in 2017, and I think 4 or 5 of those were submitted with non-RCT data. When we look at the recommendations and compare those with submissions with non-comparative trial data versus those with RCT, we can see that almost 60% of those submitted with limited data received a negative recommendation from pCODR, whereas only 16% of those submitted with RCT data received a negative recommendation. And again, if you look over time, the numbers are pretty stable in terms of, or consistent, I should say, with respect to RCT submissions. You get about an average of 2 negative recommendations per year. Whereas if you look on the left at the non-comparative data sets, you see that there does seem to be a trend towards an increasing number of, or an increasing rate, obviously, and number of negative recommendations beginning about mid-2015 when we look at the data. And this is obviously concerning to us. And when we dug a little deeper, what we were able to find is that common conclusions for both positive and negative recommendations in the PERC, published in the PERC recommendations, those that for limited data sets that receives positive recommendation, some of the conclusions that were repeated often were a significant unmet need in the patient population, a lack of existing safe and/or effective treatment options, small patient population, and infeasibility to conduct an RCT in the target population. For those which received a negative recommendation, in every case, PERC cited the uncertainty of the net clinical benefit due to non-comparative data, although they did, in most cases, acknowledge clinical efficacy, such as anti-tumor activity. And then another common remark was the existence of an ongoing RCT or the feasibility to conduct an RCT in the target population. And high potential budget impact was noted about half the time, 50% of the submissions. And then if we look a little closer, what we noticed with every negative recommendation, PERC cited an ongoing RCT or, more recently, the feasibility to conduct an RCT. So the submissions with blue, circled in blue, are those where there was an ongoing RCT at the time of review. And those in red, circled in red, are those where PERC concluded that an RCT was in fact feasible, although there was no RCT in process or in progress. What I think is most concerning is that the clinical guidance panels, the clinicians and patient groups who provided input very conspicuously disagreed with PERC's contention that an RCT was feasible in the latter cases. So beginning here towards the end of 2016 and into 2017, when the feasibility to conduct an RCT was certainly cited more often. And we certainly understand that there are inherent uncertainties in early phase clinical trials, and that RCTs are generally considered the gold standard of empirical medical knowledge and a source of reliable evidence. However, RCTs are not always feasible or ethical for evaluation of new therapeutic drugs. And I would say this is especially true in the case of many of the new therapies that are coming through the drug pipeline now for cancer treatment. And the reasons vary, and it could be in rare diseases or distinct molecular subtypes where there are few patients. It's extremely difficult to find enough patients to conduct an RCT. When evidence of significant improvement in clinical endpoints is seen in early trials, it then potentially becomes unethical to conduct an RCT, as you would subject 50% of the trial participants to an inferior, we generally would know is an inferior therapy. In heavily treated populations, there's often a lack of a common comparator that can be used. And in rapidly evolving therapeutic areas, which includes cancer, results are often outdated before they are published, and we have seen that recently as well. And last but not least, there is often a lack of interest on the part of manufacturers if a drug has already come to market in the US and has been approved there by the FDA and as well as in Europe. There is certainly less motivation on their part to conduct further clinical trials. So examples that we've found in pCODR reviews over the past couple of years that really illustrate these issues. I'm going to present two of them to you. The first one is for a targeted small molecule kinase inhibitor therapy for a very rare subtype of lymphoma called Waldenstroms Macroglobulinemia. It's WM, it's easier. It received a negative pCODR recommendation in November of 2016. And PERC noted that this drug had the ability to control symptoms with fewer toxic side effects than available therapies in an easy-to-take-home pill format that is extremely important to patients. However, it was not confident of the net clinical benefit due to the limitations of the evidence, and they believed that a phase 3 RCT was feasible or is feasible in this population. However, if you look at the clinical guidance panel's report, they do point out that WM has an annual incidence of only 5 cases per million people in Canada, making it very difficult to recruit enough patients to evaluate important clinical endpoints like progression-free survival and overall survival in an RCT, even internationally. They also noted that treatment choice is largely guided by data from non-comparative phase 2 studies and prior treatment history. Therefore, making comparisons between currently available agents and new therapies pretty challenging. And there is no standard treatment for relapsed WM currently in Canada, limiting the feasibility of assessing ibrutinib against a single comparator in this setting. So despite all of these very rational arguments on the part of the clinical guidance panel, disagreed about the feasibility of an RCT in this population. And as I noted earlier, we've seen this in a few recommendations recently. Another example, and this first example is really about patient numbers, practicalities of conducting an RCT in a very small population. In the second example that I'm going to talk about, it's more of an ethical issue. And this submission was for a monoclonal antibody named daratumumab in combination with another drug for the fourth-line treatment of multiple myeloma, another type of blood cancer, relatively uncommon. And again, PERC noted that they weren't confident of net clinical benefit due to the limitations of the evidence, and they believed that an RCT would be feasible to determine efficacy compared to available treatment options or best supportive care. And in this case, the clinical guidance panel, as well as the clinicians who provided input and the patient group that provided input, all very strongly stated that an RCT of the drug compared to best supportive care was both not feasible for pragmatic and ethical reasons. Patients would likely decline participation if they know that they could get a better treatment through another trial or from another agent. And the clinicians generally felt that it was unethical to enroll patients in the trial comparing the drug with best supportive care when the toxicity and the effectiveness of the suggested best supportive care had proven detrimental to these patients. So these are just two examples from our analysis. But what's really important is what is the impact of these pCODR recommendations on access, especially if there is no RCT plans for this patient population. And what we've seen is that funding requests that receive a negative recommendation from pCODR are very unlikely to receive funding from public drug plans. It's been noted that all submissions that receive negative recommendations and requested pricing negotiations at PCPA resulted in PCPA deciding not to negotiate collectively or individually at the provincial and territorial level. And what is also concerning is that private payers are increasingly relying on public HTA recommendations to inform their reimbursement criteria for innovative high-priced therapies, many of which are cancer therapies. And as of the end of 2017, only 5 funding requests that initially received negative recommendations based on non-comparative data were resubmitted with evidence from RCTs. Should be noted that all of them did subsequently receive positive recommendations. However, resubmission did result in significant access delays, up to 500 or over 500 days for one of these therapies. So what is the solution to this problem? How do we get these potentially life-saving therapies to the patients who need them? And again, we understand that there are inherent limitations in estimating the value of a new treatment using single-arm clinical trials. But small non-comparative trials are increasingly becoming the final stage of clinical evaluation for new cancer drugs in some indications or disease settings, especially for rare cancers, for tumors with distinct molecular profiles, or where no standard of care exists. Therefore, we need to find and/or develop mechanisms that provide timely access to these therapies while also addressing the long-term uncertainty and value in order to ensure that cancer patients in Canada can benefit from these treatments when they need them. So instead of simply complaining about the problem, we did seek to identify some concrete and practical solutions that could be implemented relatively quickly within the existing systems and processes that we have in place at CADIS, PCPA, and amongst the payers. And the first of these really already exists within CADIS recommendation framework, at least in principle. And that is to provide funding recommendations conditional on collection of additional evidence. And early in 2016, CADIS revised its recommendation framework to include a number of potential clinical criteria and/or conditions that could be used to support a funding recommendation. And they included quite a few examples of clinical criteria and conditions that could apply. And some of these relate, obviously, one of the conditions that is universally applied to recommendations or positive recommendations is reduced price. But others could include limiting to one distinct subgroup of patients, the duration of treatment, the considerations related to companion diagnostics, and so on and so on. And another sort of condition that they did list, that's sort of buried in their list a little bit, is real-world evidence development for scenarios where there's uncertain clinical benefit but significant unmet need. And we do feel that this could be utilized, and it hasn't as of yet that we know of. Actually, I shouldn't say that. I will show you a slide at the end of this presentation that actually contradicts what I just said. But a recommendation could be issued to provide temporary funding with the condition that additional evidence is collected. And under such circumstances, obviously, policies and procedures regarding the evidence collection would need to be established by either pCODR, PCPA, or the payers, or a combination of these stakeholders. And furthermore, it's not insignificant. Changes to the pricing negotiations through PCPA, the PCA process, and alternative pricing and reimbursement strategies would likely need to be adopted. And this scenario of conditional reimbursement pending collection of further evidence has been implemented in the UK via the Cancer Drug Fund, which makes a drug available to patients much earlier while additional evidence is gathered to resolve the areas of clinical uncertainty. So this is not a pie-in-the-sky idea. It is a practical recommendation that has been implemented in other jurisdictions, and certainly it would be plausible for pCODR to adopt. In addition to acquiring more robust or mature trial data, real-world evidence can be collected to resolve value uncertainty, and I'm a little reluctant to use this term because it gets real-world evidence, because it gets thrown around a lot these days, and there's a lot of discussion around it. However, it doesn't seem that we're doing a whole lot, or we have done a whole lot to implement collection and analysis of it yet in this country anyway. I could be wrong, and please someone chime in the question box if that is the case. But potential collaborations between private and public stakeholders could be leveraged for this purpose. And, provincial cancer agencies have started to generate real-world evidence from routinely collected health administrative databases and patient registries to be used in this capacity. In Ontario, there is the evidence building program for cancer drugs, which was, I believe, instituted for this purpose. Not a lot has been done with the program so far, likely a matter of lack of resources and capacity. But other provincial cancer agencies, such as Alberta Health Services and the BC Cancer Agency, maintain large databases that include extensive clinical data, which could also be used to assess new cancer treatments. As well, there are some Canadian research networks that have initiated the development of disease-specific registries that could help support research efforts to improve treatment and management in this respect as well. So we have these resources, and there are some programs in place. We need a little bit of a kick in the behind to get these things going and up and running and expanded. And I do really think this is where CADIS and pCODR could take a lead. I have to say, the agency is full of really intelligent and capable people and does seem to be nimble enough to take this on without years and years and years of prior consultation, like many of the larger bureaucracies. And with that, I think my time, I'm doing okay. I am going to end on a somewhat positive note and share with you some of the recent pCODR recommendations that have come out early this year, just in the past 2-3 months, for submissions supported by limited data sets, so non-comparative data, or in one case, actually, a phase 2 RCT. And I am quite happy to see, and I have no idea whether or not we had any influence with our white paper on these recommendations, or whether this is just a natural evolution in PERC's, I guess, deliberations. Anyway, what we have seen is that a number of new therapies have received positive conditional recommendations. And one of these, venetoclax for CLL, relapsed or refractory patients, initially actually received a negative recommendation, but upon reconsideration, received a positive recommendation with the condition that an improvement in cost effectiveness in the form of substantial price reduction until more robust clinical data are made available for future assessment. So this is actually the first case that we know of anyway, where an initial negative recommendation has in fact been reversed. And this is also one of the, certainly this recommendation with the condition is aligns well with what we are recommending in our paper as well. And there have been a few more submissions since then that have received positive recommendations for some subsets of patients while receiving a negative for another, so partly positive. As well as another conditional positive with the condition being time-limited reimbursement until more robust clinical data can be collected for future assessment. So I think these are all positive moves forward, positive changes at pCODR, and hopefully it doesn't stop here. We would certainly like to see the HTA process evolve in line with how therapies are coming to market and are being studied these days. So with that, I will open to questions. And I see that there are a few here. Okay, so I will read out the question and I will hopefully have an answer. The pCODR process is very rigid in that the initial submission by the PI is all of the information that is considered along with the on-record patient groups. If the data is deficient, there is no recourse. pCODR will not address inaccurate data later in the process. Once a decision is made, there is no do-over. Okay, so this isn't a question, this is a statement. This process is flawed. Number of statements. There's one about evidence building from Cancer Care Ontario, which would not cover any oral drugs. And then there's, again, a question about whether there are any oral therapies available through the EAP, Exceptional Access Program coverage. I do know that there are at least a couple of newer oral take-home cancer therapies that have been added to the EAP coverage list. I do not know how many, and I don't know whether this is going to continue or whether we will in fact adopt, the province will adopt more universal coverage of these therapies anytime in the near future. Perhaps Robin has something more to add about that. Oh, here, this is a good question. Do you see a place for Pharma in the collection of real-world data to support funding conditional reimbursement decisions? Personally, I think Pharma has a responsibility in this process. I guess I should have mentioned that. I do think they should be involved. And I do think, I understand there are issues around potentially privacy and sharing of the data with industry, but I do think that both private and public stakeholders should definitely be, including pharmaceutical industry, should be involved in that process. Another question, what do you think changed by mid-2015 in terms of the trend you found of an increasing number of negative recommendations? Do you feel positive about the recent recommendations, some of which were positive? I think what changed was simply the volume, the number of submissions and that were being submitted with limited data sets, but also the number of submissions overall, I think started to increase in 2015, and I'm guessing that those in charge of the provincial drug budgets, had some say in whether or not, to provide positive funding recommendations for these therapies. Another question, are there any plans to take your white paper to elected officials, either provincial or federal, especially as the looming election cycles? So we've got Louise Binder on that. So those of you who know Louise will know that, which is probably most of you know that it is in good hands, and it will be shared with as many people as possible, from politicians to policymakers. And they will certainly not be able to ignore her. So yes, that is part of our plans in the near future. Let me see. Do you see a place for drug access navigators to assist in data collection or anything that this group could do to assist? We are a large group with direct access to patients. I have actually in the past consulted some drug access navigators for this very reason, because they deal with patients on a regular basis, and especially those who have trouble accessing therapies, and are a great source of information. And if there's any way, certainly to involve them in the collection of evidence, I think they'd be a great asset to that process. How can the patient input component of the pCODR application play a role in addressing these issues you outlined, specifically for non-RCT submissions? So, not entirely sure what you're asking, but perhaps asking about what additional information the patients can provide to add, obviously, to the limited data sets. And that's certainly something that we try to capture in our patient submissions, including their preferences with regard to treatments, the experiences they have with the drugs under review, and the cancers that they have in general that they have, and the disease and their previous therapies. What value that brings to the discussion with PERC, I think that's something that you'd actually have to ask them, as we're not as patient groups entirely sure. So another question. This is an issue that is hard for the lay patient to understand, but it unquestionably impacts them. How do you make this a publicly understood issue? We are currently working on that. We are trying to translate this information into a much more patient-friendly or lay-friendly publication. certainly shortened, but also simplified. It is a complex topic, and so this isn't an easy task, but we are hoping to help educate and inform patients on this issue as well.
So excuse me, Liz, I wanted to just pipe in here that yes, that is part of our strategy. We are in the process of working on that document, and as soon as it's ready, we'll be glad to share it with you.
Let me see here. Okay, one last question. In your opinion, do you believe pharma partners have a role in designing studies to mitigate uncertainties with non-comparative trials? Absolutely, I do. I think where an RCT is possible, certainly. Oh, sorry, we're talking about non-comparative trials. So if an RCT is not practical, not feasible, not ethical, I do feel like the our pharma partners do have not a duty, but a responsibility to provide potentially, longer assessment in non-comparative trials, potentially larger trial cohorts. The problem is that most of these trials are designed in other jurisdictions, and because these therapies are approved, namely in the US, based on the existing data or studies, this is a little bit more difficult for us, or I should say for the pharma partners likely in Canada to have an impact on. However, I do feel like this is a discussion that they should be having with their counterparts wherever at their global offices or in the US, wherever that may be. Okay, I think that is all the questions, and I think we've lost Allison on the audio. So I would like to thank everybody who attended, and also again CCSN for hosting us. And as you can see on your screen, their contact information, website, and I do believe the recording of the webinar will be available on their website within the next couple of days.